the kids' class. Ready to go there, Mr. Daniel? One of the most familiar passages that I know all of us know, it's found in the Gospel accounts, is what is referred to as the Beatitudes. How many messages must you have heard about the Beatitudes? I don't think I've ever actually taught a message on Beatitudes. I just don't think I ever really have. But what they are, if you remember, are 8 blessings that open up Yeshua's memorable Sermon on the Mount, which sounds very glorious. He's just climbing up to the top of a hill, and he's, in the rocks, he's parking his butt above everybody else, and speaking to the crowds, just a little bit below him. And this is recorded, at least officially, in the 5th chapter of Matthew. Let me read them for you here. Matthew chapter 5, verse 3. How blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. How blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. How blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. How blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. How blessed are those who show mercy, for they will be shown mercy. And how blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And how blessed are those who make peace, for they will be called sons of God. And finally, how blessed are those who are persecuted because they pursue righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. The term beatitude is actually Latin in origin. It's from the noun beatitudo. You know what that means literally? Any thoughts? Happiness. Happiness. Each beatitude is a source of happiness. Each beatitude consists of 2 phrases. You had the condition, and then you had the result. Amen? Now, the origin of these 8 proclamations, believe it or not, is straight from the Tanakh, or the Old Testament if you don't know what that is. Yeshua taught Torah. We've pretty much established that in this congregation. He taught Torah. That was his scriptures. But he did so a little bit differently than the rabbis of his day. He did so with a focus on the spirit of the Torah, on the spirit of love, and the spirit of humility. It's what he says following those 8 Beatitudes that I want to focus on this morning. I want to draw your attention towards. And that's in Matthew 5:13. Where Yeshua declares the following. You are salt for the land. You are salt for the land. But if salt becomes tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except being thrown out for people to trample on. Now we know that technically this phrase, you are salt for the land, is supposed to apply to us, people of Yeshua's way. We are to be salt of the land. Yeshua is to all his followers scattered throughout the world to preserve the good news and to declare this good news to all who will listen. It's not always easy finding people who actually listen. I know that's our calling as is faithful. Go forth declaring the good news, all the nations of the world. But I don't know about you. For me, there are a lot of days I just don't feel up to it, quite frankly. There's some days I just don't feel up to it. And maybe that's not sounding hyper spiritual and godly for you, but some days I just don't have it in me. And as a salt of the land, I'm not always motivated to be poured into the wounds of the world. At times, I'm not altogether certain that my presence will even make any kind of difference for the healing of those wounds. What good am I? Sometimes I ask, what good am I? What difference am I really making? After all, I'm just a single grain of salt. rather insignificant if you think about it. Of course, when Yeshua uttered these words, for the most part, his audience was what? I mean, think about it. What was his audience? Theologians? The sages? Torah teachers? The rich? The influential? The elders? No. For the most part, his audience was a bunch of poor, struggling folks, not unlike a lot of you, with chronic illnesses and mixed in were a few smelly fishermen. When Yeshua got up on that mountain and announced, "You are the salt of the earth," I wonder how many of them, "Amen, Jim, amen, hallelujah, brother." But in their hearts, it went in one ear and out the other. And he's probably speaking of that person over there. It's not me. Up until this point, most of the attendants were, to the society of the time, disposable people. Disposable. But when Yeshua declares to them, "You are the salt of the earth," he's imparted upon them a purpose, a worth, a value, a calling, a destiny, cause. And I'll bet even his Talmudim look at each other, and the ones that are following him. And then down to crowds, each other, down to crowds. And back up to Yeshua and thought to themselves, "Not me, baby. You got this." Because they really it hadn't sunk in about his death, burial, and resurrection. Even though he's told them how many times. How many times have I said something over and over? It's as if you never heard me. And it was no different for him. He must have told them 5, 6, 7 times, "I'm going to suffer and die, and then be buried, and the third day rise again for the..." He told them. He told them what was going to happen. So they're thinking, we're just following this guy. We're not going to do this ourselves. They were, after all, the same people he just blessed in the Beatitudes. Yeshua just got done saying, "Blessed are the hopeless. Blessed are the hurting. Blessed are the helpless. Blessed are the hungry. Blessed are the harassed." And they were happy for a blessing. Everybody here is happy for a blessing. I can impart a blessing onto you. I do it at the end of the service, the Aaronic benediction. Someone say, "That's not your place to do that. You're not from the Aaronic priesthood." Well, cut me some slack. I like the blessing, I'm going to deliver it. Everybody's glad to get a blessing, and I think we're all glad when somebody's thinking about us and praying for us and praying, wishing well of us. But now he's telling this bunch of perpetual losers who've gotten the short end of the stick, everything they've ever laid their hands on, "You are the salt of the earth." And some of these people have never had a good day in their life. But Yeshua insists, "You are the salt of the earth." And Yeshua was looking at the most vulnerable people in this world and saying, "God's counting on you all to save the world." And that's what being the salt of the earth is all about. That the most vulnerable are to God the most valuable. Did you hear when I said that? You need to hear that. That the most vulnerable people are to God the most valuable people. Rabbi Shaul, Apostle Paul, he picked up on the same message expressed in our Ketuvim Shel Mashiach portion from the second letter in Corinth. How God has chosen to do his work in the world through vulnerable people. Like blind Bartimaeus, whom I referred to in our Yom Teruah message. Remember that message? If you can't see it, thank you. Somebody listened. Shout! I scared the babies. 2 Corinthians 4:6. Rabbi Shaul challenging the congregation of Corinth that light should shine out of darkness. Light should shine out of darkness. God is the one, Rabbi Shaul explained, who has made his light shine in our hearts, the light of the knowledge of God's glory shining in the face of Messiah Yeshua. Then Shaul says, we have this treasure, this powerful presence of God through Yeshua. It's in clay pots. That is our fragile, precarious lives. You see, in ancient Corinth, people made lanterns out of disposable clay pots. That's what they did. They were little lanterns out of those clay pots. And because this earthenware vessels were so thin, the clay pots would let the light out. And these cheap pots were perfect vessels for carrying light. The clay pots, however, did not produce light, like let's say you bought a lantern at Walmart or something, or you had a flashlight. They didn't produce the light, they were just carriers of the light. And Rabbi Shaul says the same thing about himself and about all of us. We have this treasure in clay pots so that the awesome power that belongs to God that's within us doesn't come from us, though. Just like those clay pots, our vulnerability, our weakness, our limits, the tender spots in our lives make us, guess what? Perfect. The perfect vessels for God to work through in the world. And let's be honest. Nobody here is really comfortable with the concept of vulnerability. Nobody likes it. Nobody embraces that. For example, one of the problems of growing up, remember when you were a child? Remember way back when? You remember that?
Can't remember.
Remember, one time you were little like those guys. We were all little like those guys. So if you look back, if you think back to when you're little and then you begin to grow up, one of the dark side of pardon the pun of that is that we began to learn to hide things. See, for some reason, when we are older, we're no longer comfortable letting the truth out about ourselves. What we're struggling with, what we're feeling, what we fear, what we want to be named known. When we're younger, well, you were here the other night, a lot of you. When I illustrated the other night in young Teruah, it didn't seem to matter when you were younger. If we were scared, we'd grab the hand of mom or dad. If they weren't right there, we wouldn't hesitate looking around and start shouting, "Mom, Dad! Where are you?" Right? As kids, if you're not feeling well, we'd simply say, "I'm sick." If we had to go, we'd say, "Gotta go to the bathroom." Didn't hear any of you yell that out this morning. But some of the kids would go, "Gotta go! Gotta go potty." And if we struggled keeping up, maybe you weren't as fast as your brother or sister, or maybe your friend. They ran real fast, they were real athletic. Because I'm not as fast as you, I can't keep up. Or I'm not as smart as you, I can't get straight A's like you, I try. But as we become older, however, we're reticent to vulnerability. We grow reluctant to uncovering that kind of authenticity. We grow adept at hiding what is really going on inside of us to prevent revealing our particular area of vulnerability. James Dobson, some of you might remember him from years ago, he had a great word. He said, "We are not who we are." We are not who we are. We're not even who we think we are. But we are what other people think we are. We are what other people think we are. Amen? Maybe for many of us, it's because being vulnerable conjures up images of being helpless, being needy. See, vulnerability to us is like an article of clothing that doesn't fit us or looks silly in us or clashes with our complexion. I'm a summer and I can't wear this outfit. Probably most of us don't really like to put it on. Think about it, when somebody brings up vulnerability, I bet hardly any of us, when we hear the word vulnerability, think of ourselves as a victim of vulnerability. when you think vulnerability, you don't think of yourself. We think of small children who wander off with strangers or fall into gorilla enclosures like that one kid did a few years back. We think about elderly widows who aren't very tech savvy. Imagine them falling for that rich Nigerian who emails them begging for a place to park his money. Right? We think of some homeless person in a wet winter evening. We think about refugees and sweatshop workers. We think about people in nursing homes. We think about young girls and women who've been trafficked. I'm fairly certain when we hear the word vulnerable, the last thing that comes to mind is ourselves. Vulnerability is a word for the other people, not for us. And it looks great on widows and orphans and beggars, but not on you and me. We're not vulnerable. We got this. Of course, vulnerability isn't something that only happens to other people. Truth is, deep down, we all know this. It's just we don't like to admit it. We resist accepting the limitations of vulnerability, accepting the truth that we are not invincible, that we can be hurt, that we can be sick, that we can be tired, that we can be confused, that we can have emotions that overwhelm us, that we will grow old and not be able to look like we used to or do what we used to, that we wear out, that our bodies have an expiration date that we all are going to face. Vulnerability is the price that we all pay being human. Whether we accept it or not, we are all vulnerable somehow. Isn't that what the enemy targets? He targets your vulnerability. He sizes you up. He plans and plots. And then he attacks an area of vulnerability. And we all live in the delusion that somehow we can guard against that and protect ourselves from that. But how often do we end up being a victim of it? We get frustrated by that. Look at brothers and sisters. I might be dating myself, but Superman was vulnerable. Wasn't he? What was he vulnerable to? Kryptonite. And everyone here has some kryptonite. I don't know what your personal kryptonite is, but you all have it. Kryptonite. Each one of us have a deficiency in our character. Some chink in our emotional armor. Some crack in our moral foundation. Somewhere somebody can poke us, right? There's a spot. I used to be pretty good at it. I could size up that little spot and poke you at it really good. Oh, boy. I know what it is. And sometimes it's intentional by somebody and sometimes it's not. How many times have you been in the company of somebody and they're upset about something? You don't have a clue what you said or done. Especially like in a marriage. You know what you said. You know what you did. I don't. Well, you should know. You know, to lose. You care, but, you know. But there's a place where we get poked at and it hurts really bad. It's an area in our lives that's never really quite healed. Some button in our life that never fails to get a reaction from us when it's pushed. But we have just heard Rabbi Shaul speak the good news about our vulnerability, that we have this treasure in clay pots so that the awesome power belongs to God and it won't come from us. Just like fragile clay pots make perfect lamps, your fragile lives, our fragile lives, turn out to be perfect vessels for God's power to do its work. Not just for us and in us, but in the world, for the world that we live in. Rabbi Shaul confessed it early in his own ministry. We sometimes overlook, we get so caught up in the theology that we lose sight of the person who was responsible for a lot of that theology. He writes it in his first letter to Corinth. In chapter 2 of his very first letter to Corinth, he's writing from Ephesus, and here Rabbi Shaul is burying his soul. I'll read it to you. When I arrived among you, it was not with surpassing eloquence or wisdom that I came announcing to you the previously concealed truth about God. Well, if anybody had a concept about God, it was Rabbi Shaul. The irony is that there were few others that could hold the pedigree that Rabbi Shaul had, from who he was taught and how he was raised. If anybody's going to know about God, it's Rabbi Shaul. If anybody served God, it was Rabbi Shaul. And he's saying, I didn't have surpassing eloquence. I wasn't very wise. And then he goes on to say, also, I myself was with you as somebody weak. I don't know that you've ever heard few of any pastors stand in the pulpit and go, I'm weak, and I'm nervous, and I'm shaking all over from fear. Well, guess what? That was Rabbi Shaul. He's writing it down, and he's sending it to another congregation that he serves at. You know, I'm somebody that's weak. I'm somebody that's really nervous about what I'm doing, and I'm shaking all over from fear. His comfort zone would have been a message that relied upon, he says, compelling words of wisdom from the Torah. But instead, he confesses his vulnerability by leaning instead on the Spirit of God and being committed to an area that he wasn't so comfortable with, that was fresh and new to him. By being committed to, and the scripture says, forgetting everything except Yeshua, the Messiah, crucified. Do you get it? If you wonder what the way of Messiah is, what the way that we are headed, it's forgetting everything except Yeshua, the Messiah, crucified. That was the Jew of Jews, the rabbi of rabbis, the man of God of men of God, saying, I'm forgetting it all. My focus is on Messiah crucified. And the cost of his vulnerability profited him. You know how? In humility. So later on in 2 Corinthians, the second letter, chapter 12, verses 7 to 8, Rabbi Shaul will mention that he had a thorn in his body as well. And he calls this thorn a messenger from Hasatan sent to torment me. And we can't rightly say what this messenger from Hasatan was, but whomever it was, it helped to make Shaul vulnerable. So he says, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times for it to leave me alone. And God's response to Shaul was, my grace is enough. Because power is made perfect in weakness. Well, that's comforting. Power is made perfect in a weakness. Wow, that just doesn't square with the world, does it? That you are powerful because of your weakness. Confessed weakness, I should add. Literally, what God told Shaul was, your weakness is the beginning of my power. My power begins when yours will end. When your power comes to an end, that's where I am strong. And that means the vulnerable places in our lives don't have to be places of shame or blame or anxiety or endless frustration. They can be the very places where God's awesome power pours into our lives and immerses, I should say, every bit of us in the transforming grace of God. Wise old rabbi named Bob Dylan once said, ain't no use jiving, ain't no use joking, because everything is broken. And a few years later, another wise old rabbi named Leonard Cohen answered, There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. But according to Shaul, that's how the light gets out. Shaul wrote his second letter to Corinth during a time when many in that congregation had forgotten something pretty darn important. I think a lot of congregations are guilty of this. They had forgotten that they were clay pots. That really, they're clay pots or carriers of God's light. Now, some of the Corinthians had started to think that they could produce their own light. There are congregations in this area that believe, as sons and daughters of God, you produce the light. They forget that Messiah Yeshua had chosen those who are vulnerable in this world to be the vessels for God's love, to be the vessels for God's grace and mercy and wisdom. What had happened was a super PAC. It was a super PAC of super Christians had infiltrated the Kehilat in Corinth with their $300 haircuts, fancy suits, lots of jewelry, perfect teeth, trophy wives, cool cars. They had the package. Even their children were above average. Their dogs pooped gold. Their challah never fell. Their houses were immaculate. Their message was that all their good fortune and success was a sign of God's anointing. And these super Christians were able to gain influence in the Corinthian church, partly because the Corinthian culture worshipped visible signs of success. Corinth was the LA of the day. Now, unless you've lived in LA, that probably is not a good illustration. But it's very real to me. I know what it's like to live in the perfect city. Everybody's perfect. Everybody is impressed with image. I was just talking to the guy doing the parking lot. Lived in LA for a couple of years, and that was the comment right out of his mouth. Comment right out of his mouth. He goes, yeah. In fact, the guy I helped them lived in LA too. And they're both saying, oh yeah, I remember living there. He says, everybody was so conscious about appearances, about what they drive and how they look and what they wear and where they live and what they do, that it matters. And as is often the case, many in attendance of those congregations, especially in Corinth, they were just baby believers, and many of which were just straight unconfessed believers. And that is, they hadn't quite figured out in that congregation that their culture or society at large and the gospel weren't telling the same story. Everywhere you went in Corinth, there was some plaque or statue or billboard celebrating somebody's victory or achievement. Thank God those people don't have Facebook. And I wish a lot of you did.
So do I. I don't have.
You'd be a lot better off. Corinthians only liked winners. I like winners. They had no room for weakness or struggle or vulnerability in their lives or in their theology. I experienced a lot of that in the time I've been ministering. I've had relationships with a lot of pastors, a lot of messianics. I know nobody will ever say it, but they'll view me as a failure. I'm not a winner. I haven't achieved. I know what that's like. They'll, like I said, they'll never say it. And I think a lot of the body of Messiah today is caught up with that, about what is being a victorious and a winner, an achiever for the body of Messiah. So here comes these super Christians. Actually, Paul refers to them in Scripture as super emissaries. And they swooped in with the latest church growth strategy and technology to make the gospel more relevant to the Corinthian culture. They boasted of their success, their breakthroughs, their innovations, their credentials, affiliations, of all the rabbis that they know and all the awards that they've gotten and all the places they've been and all the mega churches they have planted or been part of, how cutting edge that they were. By contrast, look at Shaul. If we could meet anybody that had a reason to boast, had something he could back it up. He wasn't talk. He had substance. Right? Look at him. He had every reason to boast, but did instead, modeling the Tanakh. Let anyone who wants to boast about Adonai. So to the society at large, think about it. Shaul was viewed more as a loser than as a winner. That boy had it all. Now he's hanging around with all them people in the way. He used to be killing them, and now he's palling with them. What's wrong with that boy? He has no money. He's got no clothes. Doesn't have any cool tattoos. Has no place to live or money for food. He's always in trouble with the law. Constantly in and out of jail. Look at the car he drives. God is definitely not blessing that guy. Rabbi Shaul wore his vulnerability and the chips and the cracks in his clay pot like a medal. Who is weak without my sharing their weakness, he asked in 2 Corinthians 11. And the super Christians, they weren't impressed. And some of the Corinthians bought into their ideas about success. Shaul to them was a loser, and they were embarrassed. Even his followers were embarrassed that their teacher was always in some scrape or another. Constant drama with this boy. Some of them probably even whispered that Shaul's ongoing troubles were a sign that God was angry at him. That was judgment upon him. That's why he's having all this trouble. It's almost like those super Christians had straight up forgotten that this whole thing started when Yeshua gathered a handful of fishermen and a crowd of the biggest losers in Galilee and told them, you're the salt of the earth. It's almost like they'd forgotten, or at least wanted everyone else to forget, that their Messiah, do you remember him? He'd been rejected. Messiah had been abandoned. Messiah had been executed on a stake. And so these church growth experts who were stirring up the Corinthians against Shaul made a thought of themselves as super Christians, but they were rejecting the real Yeshua. The real Yeshua was vulnerable. He was vulnerable to, and he was vulnerable for the people. And I can assure you that Messiah is not in the church today.
That's right.
I can assure you of that. The real Yeshua welcomed people that everyone else had written off as weak and worthless. That's a quality that my mentor had. Extremely intelligent, successful by the world's standards, but when you were in his company, you were the most important person in the world. He never spoke above you or below you. He was always eye to eye to you. He welcomed everyone, no matter if they were considered weak, worthless, or disposable. The real Yeshua, and that's the heart of Yeshua, revealed the glory of God in the weakness of his cross. They wanted to kick the real Yeshua to the curb along with Shaul, who reminded them too much of the real Yeshua. They wanted to replace the real Yeshua with a Corinthian-friendly Yeshua. A Yeshua who taught a gospel of success and prosperity and winning. There would be no room in it for losers. When someone despises any sign of weakness or vulnerability, that's not strength, brothers and sisters. That's not power. No, in reality, it's shame. It's fear. It's supposed that insecure people adopt to hide their own feelings of inadequacy. Oh, yeah. There's a lot of that going on. A lot of insecure people hiding their own feelings of inadequacy, and it's toxic. Truth is, it's only when, according to this quote, it's only when you're completely vulnerable that you can be completely strong. That's Bible. Mr. Rogers, remember Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
All right, Mr. Rogers used to say it this way: the greatest gift you ever give is your honest self. This is what Shaul had learned following Yeshua. And this is what Shaul learned ministering to people and all their weaknesses. We are all vulnerable. Whether you admit it or not, you are. This had been true even for Yeshua during his earthly ministry. But Yeshua learned and leaned into his vulnerability. He leaned into it. For the sake of his followers and his friends, for the sake of those He met who were in need, and for the sake of those who would follow after him. And that's you and I today. Do you follow Yeshua? Are you followers of the way of Yeshua? Well, the way of Yeshua was leaning upon his vulnerability. And because Yeshua embraced vulnerability, God worked powerfully through his life. And we're still experiencing the good that comes from God's power working through Yeshua's vulnerability. Paul discovered that what was true for Yeshua could also be true for him, could be true for all of us. That's why later on in the second letter to Corinth, he wrote, chapter 13, verse 4, that although Yeshua was executed on a stake in weakness, now he lives by God's power. And we too are weak in union with him, but in dealing with you, we will live with him by God's power. That's the point, brothers and sisters. God worked powerfully through the vulnerability of his son, Yeshua. God worked powerfully in vulnerability. And everything in our kishkas, everything in our spirit resists that. Everything. That's why we don't have deep, serious relationships. That's why people live together before they get married. That's why people have superficial relationships, acquaintances that aren't real friends. That's why people engage each other more on the internet than they do person to person. That's why that happens. Because we don't want to be vulnerable. You just can't live well, brothers and sisters, without leaning into vulnerability. You can't. Trying new things requires what? Vulnerability. If I was to sit down and try to learn to play that piano, I could pretty much assure you that Linda's a lot better at it than I am. And you would probably laugh at me. Yeah, you would. Oh my gosh, he's pathetic. One hearing? No, you don't. But it requires vulnerability. It requires vulnerability to stand up here.
Yep.
What if you're sitting back there and I'm looking at you and you go, this guy's clueless. He doesn't even know the word of God. What is he saying? I don't get it. That's being vulnerable. Right? Leaning into vulnerability. Trying new things. Opening yourself up to the possibility of failure. I remember I did the Faster Pastor race. Remember I did the Faster Pastor? So I'm in somebody's race car with like 6 other pastors, you know. And you're feeling it. You feel like, I want to win this thing. But then I'm driving somebody else's car, so I don't want to trash somebody else's car. Right? And I've never raced a front-wheel drive car on a dirt track ever in my life. Right? But I got, 30 people from the congregation up there rooting for me, right? So either I just don't do the race at all, or I put myself in that place of vulnerability. What's wrong with this dude? Can't he keep up with these other pastors? I think I did like 3rd or 4th, or I don't know, 7th, 7 guys, So I love cars, and I love driving fast, but those guys are a lot better at it than I was. It's okay. So in some respect, I didn't win.
But you tried.
I tried. It's like me trying to create something. I don't have the gift. My wife's got the gift. When we're working together in a furniture store, I can tell somebody that's going to work or not going to work. But if you ask me to create a room for you, to give you ideas, I can kind of throw something at you, but I'll never do it as good as Rochelle. I don't. I'll just admit it right to people. You know what? I'll give my wife for this. She's much more, she can create what I can't create. I know my limitations. So I'm just going to say, Rochelle, you create. I might agree or disagree, but I don't have that strength to create. But when you try it, it requires vulnerability, right? People might not see your vision. You might look foolish. When I go to this wedding today, or the funeral, I should say, there's going to be a lot of influential pastors, and I'm not going to look successful to them. I'm going to look foolish. I'm going to look foolish for what I do, how I do it, the vision I have. They don't believe in it. They think it's failing. I'm going to be foolish. I'm going to be vulnerable. What if you befriend somebody? Befriending somebody requires vulnerability because you might be rejected. Loving someone requires vulnerability because we can be deeply wounded through whomever, whatever we love. And everybody here has had a broken heart once in their life. Everybody has. One of the most famous quotes on being vulnerable came from, Sigmund Freud. We are never so vulnerable as when we love. That's a wise line. Amen?
Amen.
We are never so vulnerable as when we love. C.S. Lewis echoed the same sentiment. To love is to be vulnerable. So vulnerability is at the heart of anything worth having or being or doing. Vulnerability means that we can be hurt, frustrated, betrayed, taken advantage of, and our hearts broken. It can happen, but it's also what allows us to relate, to be moved, to have compassion, to empathize, to be creative, to take a stand. It enables and animates fellowship and friendship and community. All these become possible only when, as Mr. Rogers said, we are willing to give the gift of our honest selves. Becoming vulnerable sounds pretty scary for a lot of us, but this is really all it is. All it is giving the gift of our honest selves. Just giving the gift of your honest self. When I'm up here talking to you guys, this is really who I am. I'm not trying to be somebody else. I'm not trying to be the great orators of the day. I'm not trying to mimic or mock, not mock, but mimic other great preachers or orators. I'm just going to be who I really am. I'm going to give you the gift of my honest self. Shaul had learned from the crucified and resurrected Yeshua the gift of being vulnerable, and when he received that gift and learned to use it well, in doing so, he found great courage. He found the courage to accept who he was now. Even with his regrets, his hurts, his hang-ups, his limitations, he learned to tell his story truthfully, even the unflattering parts. So he was able to say, I'm just a clay pot. And he was able to be who he was. Not who he thought he should be, not who anybody else told him he should be. Brothers and sisters, to be who you are, that takes real courage. And the courage that allowed him to accept himself with flaws and limits also gave him compassion for others. To give them the freedom and forgiveness and understanding to be who they were. Not who he thought they should be, but who they were right then. And who they were becoming in Messiah. I'm going to wrap this up, guys, pretty quick for you. And because Shaul had the courage to be his vulnerable self and have compassion to accept others with their vulnerabilities, that made time and space for God to create connection and community between them. So the super emissaries in Corinth that rejected vulnerability, well, they're no different than the super Christians today that reject it. They reject it. They preached strength and success, and winning, while Rabbi Shaul valued and embraced vulnerability, his own and others. Didn't Yeshua exemplify that on the tree? 2,000 years later, let me tell you something. Do you remember any of those super Christians or super emissaries of the group in Corinth? No. There's no writings from them. There's no stories or tales from them. No one is preaching from anything they wrote. But we remember Shaul, don't we? 2/3 of the Ketuvim Shel Mashiach is Rabbi Shaul. We're grateful for Shaul. And people from every tribe and tongue and nation are still talking about what Shaul wrote. Why? Because courage wins. Compassion wins. Connection wins. Every time. They aren't the easy way. They aren't the comfortable way. They aren't the quickest way. They aren't the most popular way. But they always win. Amen? Close your eyes. That's the value of vulnerability. Where I am weak, he is strong. So Father, in Yeshua's name, the test for all of us is not only to value vulnerability, to see its worth, but to have the power of your Holy Spirit to invoke it in our lives. Because in our vulnerability, Father, then we have the capacity to love as Messiah loved. We can't say we love Yeshua unless we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. There is no genuine love. It's conditional. Love, true love, requires a vulnerability. Requires a vulnerability. And Father, in that relationship that we have with our groom, for it to be an honest relationship, we need us, Father, to lay down our life and be vulnerable. Not an easy place. But in this little clay pot that we call ourselves, for the light to shine through, we have to be vulnerable. Vulnerable to that heart being broken.